Welcome to my channel, where I dive into the darkest horror narratives. Got a chilling story, real or imagined, that you want me to narrate? Drop it in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales. Now close your eyes and let the terror begin. Story 1. The Ant Hill Kids. People don't die cleanly. It's messy, miserable work. Everyone fights back, regardless of age or gender. It's an animalistic instinct driven by the bolts of adrenaline rushing through their brain. Fight, resist, run, escape, live. Those were the thoughts whirling behind the bearded man's eyes as my knife slid into his body. A choked gargle spewed flecks of blood from his cracked lips, which clumped in his greasy beard. His eyes held that primal shine to them. I admired it even as the knife parted his flesh. He clung to me, choked over and over. "Deliver us from evil, O Lord. Deliver us." He struggled under me and I watched curiously. His hands left marks on my arms and life fled from his eyes with the permanence of dusk leaking into the night. Sitting back on my haunches, I examined the marks he'd left on my arms. Remnants of my past lived in my skin. Dark streaks cast across my forearms, where belts cracked down again and again, ridges of white scar tissue etched into my fingers and knuckles where knives sliced me to the bone. Long, pale lacerations from whippings crisscrossed along my spine. My eyes sat slightly off-center, a result of the sledgehammer that had cracked my skull when I was 5. I knew I should be dead, left alone in the desolate wilderness of Quebec, Canada, where a world of complete isolation created the perfect place for a madman to plant the seeds of his new cult. I suppose it would be prudent to provide context as to who I am and where I came from. Why I know what the human spirit can endure. How it felt to grow up in a commune run by a religious zealot with a vision that God would smite all but his followers sometime in the conveniently vague future. I was born in the early 70s, on the shortest, darkest day of the year, when winter winds ripped at the commune's chapel roof and shook the poorly fitted wood pilings to their core. An exhausted midwife wrapped in a ragged shawl delivered me squalling on a cheap foldable table from the womb of a younger woman bound tightly by her arms and legs. There were screams, from the midwife commanding my mother to push, from our communal leader, Robert Gauthier, leading the 30 or so followers knelt around the table in prayer. From my mother herself, digging deep furrows in the table with her nails, there were screams, and there was blood, lots of it. "Welcome. Welcome our new brother in the glory of God on high. Welcome. From this day forth, you shall help us prepare for the time of reckoning when our Lord shall send his vengeful angels down from the heavens to smite the wicked and wreak judgment upon those who do not heed his word. Welcome. Welcome." His followers echoed his call with cries of their own. "Welcome, welcome, child of God. Welcome." Robert used a grimy knife to slice my umbilical cord and placed me in my mother's arms. Naked, fetid, shivering in the cold, I could remember the moment the warmth left her body. She held me in the crook of her arm and looked up into the rafters of the chapel, and the light left her eyes. A human's will to live. I don't know why I remember those moments so vividly and not others. Maybe I had been told about them years later and simply believed I'd remembered them. I suppose this was logical. I couldn't recall what happened after the midwife slid me from my mother's arms. Those details were filled in by the kids who'd been praying during my delivery. From what they said, I realized not remembering was perhaps a blessing. Snippets of my mom's lifeless body slung into a wheelbarrow, wheeled out into the cold, and dumped down a mine shaft on the other side of the commune's hill like garbage. That seemed wrong, a violation of her memory. Humans shouldn't treat one another like that. But Robert Gauthier said otherwise. It was our duty, he said, to live through him as he was commanded by the Lord Almighty. We lived a Spartan lifestyle, simple, brutal, efficient, cruel. My earliest years were relatively unremarkable. Our community lay in the shadow of a hill, a rising knoll perhaps 600 feet high that rose above the surrounding land. The commune consisted of the chapel, a barn, a wood shop, a mess hall, a small medical hut that doubled as Robert's office, and 3 ramshackle halls where the men, women, and children slept apart from one another. The older children were tasked with looking after the younger ones. I found myself placed primarily in the care of a girl named Ali, who was 10 or 11 years older than me. She couldn't be sure of her exact age. The midwife who delivered me was named Cheryl, and she oversaw Ali during my first year or so. After that, it became Ali's job alone. We grew to love one another like siblings. Most of the children, 10 or in all, with their ages ranging from infants to early teens, kept close to one another. When we reached 15, we were moved to the adult halls. In total, there were 32 of us. Robert had 3 main disciples, Paul, Carver, and John, all of whom believed wholeheartedly in his stature as the envoy of God. They enforced his bidding with a fervor that bordered on sadism. As I grew up, I quickly learned that not following Robert's word resulted in harsh and often unnecessarily cruel punishments. Robert and his henchmen would spy on the other commune members for any sign of profane or sacrilegious behavior. Then he would confront the offender before the others, a maddened glint in his eye, and scream at them about behaving without purity. "We are the Lord's final bastion of righteousness on this earth," he preached. "We live through his divine will and shall be rewarded in turn when his angels descend upon us. If you do not heed his words as he has spoken them through me, then it falls upon my shoulders to purge the evil from you. We can only summon our Savior by living purely." What he said filled my head day and night. With no other perspective to understand much of what he was saying, I took his words to heart. These enraged sermons were spat forth with colorful hand gestures and much pacing through our old chapel. I remember sitting quietly among the kids. I was partially hidden by Ali, who did her best to conceal me behind her skinny, pale frame. She and the others would wince when Robert doled out whatever punishment he believed to be appropriate for the offense given. I only watched on with indifference. My mind was numb to the commune's horrors even then. Lighter transgressions, like humming, joking, or not selling enough of the baked goods that composed the bulk of our income, were met with beatings, lashings, and group shunning. Heavier offenses, taking the Lord's name in vain, sexual deviancy, only he was allowed to have intercourse with the women in the hopes that his seed would strengthen the commune's bloodlines, and suspected defection was left to Robert's constantly fluctuating mood. If he felt merciful, it might be getting left out overnight in the brutal cold, or being suspended from the ceiling for extended periods by your thumbs. If his mood turned sour and felt that the presence of the devil and corruption was at work among his members, then one could expect to be cleansed with a chemical enema or to maim themselves with a sledgehammer he often wielded during a session. He would bring the offender out into the center of the room and hand them the hammer, then beseech them to show repentance by striking their leg. Many commune members hobbled awkwardly atop badly knit shin bones and lopsided knees. I remember one time when a boy named Anthony walked in on Robert, forcing himself upon one of the commune women. Anthony ran off into the snow, and Robert chased after him, drunk and naked and stumbling. A metal flask glinted in his left hand. He saw the rest of the kids gathering firewood at the base of the hill and ordered us to grab Anthony. Terrified, we listened. We dragged Anthony back to the commune, kicking and screaming. He cried and begged us to let him go. I was 5 at the time and believed what he'd done must have been of great insult to the Lord. We marched him back to stand before Robert, who stood there trembling with rage in the cold winter sun. He had a look on his face like a parent disappointed that their child had been caught lying. He simply glared at Anthony, who begged him for mercy. I'd never seen a 10-year-old repent so extensively or with such passion before. Anthony invoked all the right words, Bible passages, prayers, and words of praise to Robert, and the image of God that shone through him. I was impressed. Robert was not. He swayed on his feet and took a swig from the metal flask in his hand. "Tie him up to that tree over there," he pointed. "We're gonna have a stoning." Anthony was tied up. The rough bark of the pine tree dug into his back. His eyes, wide and brown as the earth beneath us, raced from kid to kid. He landed on me last of all, piercing my gaze with a pleading so intense I caught my breath. Ali stepped up to me and pressed something cold into my hand. I looked down at the hard, smooth stone in my hand, then back at Anthony. For the first time in my life, I questioned myself. Was this truly what God wanted? I looked up at Ali. She was 15 now, old enough to be moved into the women's hall, old enough to attract the affections of the man looming over them all. Her jaw was set, and her gaze looked hollow. A tear glittered in the corner of her eye. "Just do what he says," she told me. I looked from her to Anthony and realized they both had the same vacant expression. Lusterless, desperate, devoid of hope. The same look my mother had had. I looked at Anthony once more and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then the first rock smashed into his head. Something cracked inside me that day. By the time Robert, who'd now been joined by Paul and Carver, drunkenly called for us to stop, Anthony was limp against his bindings. Only the tree held him upright. The cold winter air made the deep purple welts along his arms and legs stand out grotesquely. Robert stumbled over to check his pulse. His jagged fingernail dug into the pale flesh just below Anthony's throat. Eventually, Robert nodded and turned back to us. His words were slurred when he spoke. "This is what happens when you disobey. Our savior won't come if I can't perform my sacred duties. We need new life in this commune." He took another swig from his flask and then pointed to Ali and me. "You two take him to the shaft and dump him." We did as we were told. By the time we dragged Anthony up to the mine shaft, his body was stiff from the cold, and rigor mortis had set in. Those brown eyes stared passively into the gray slate of sky above, glassy and empty. I looked down into the shaft and realized with a start that the bones of my mother were down there. I hadn't thought about her in a long time. I realized that my last memory of her mirrored the look on Anthony's face now and wondered what his mother must be thinking. A hand gripped my shoulder. I turned to find Ali beside me, her lips peeled back in a thin grimace. She seemed to know what I was thinking about. "She helped raise me when I was younger," she said. "Protected me from Robert's ways." I nodded. That sounded nice. An unspoken agreement formed between us. Together we rolled Anthony's body back away from the shaft and into a little cleft below it. There we buried him under a pile of stones and branches. I still had a lot to figure out, but this felt better than listening to Robert's sermons. We made our way back down the hill in silence. When we got back, the other kids had dispersed to the main hall for supper, but Robert remained outside. He'd gotten dressed at least, but now he held his dreaded sledgehammer in one hand. A sickening grin twisted over his face like a rotting pumpkin, exposing brown teeth and purplish gums. "God told me you didn't do as I asked," he growled. "I said to throw him down the shaft so his blackened soul couldn't taint us anymore. So why'd you bury him instead?" Ali stepped forward. "It was my idea, Robert. Please, you can take me into the hut and we can..." She took a shuddering breath. "We can replace Anthony with a clean, pure soul." "That's mighty." "Noble of you, dear," Robert agreed. He licked his teeth and nodded to Paul and Carver, who were marching back down the hill. I realized they were Robert's so-called message from God. They took Ali by her arms. "But we still gotta repent. Salvation won't come if we don't do as we're told." He raised his sledgehammer and brought it crashing down on my head. The only thing that saved me was Robert's drunkenness. His swaying threw his aim off so that instead of crushing my skull, he only glanced at the top of my head. Still, that was enough to send a thundering shock tearing across my vision in waves of scarlet, purple, and black. My eyesight blurred, then went dark, and something in my mind cracked. I fell to the snow, stunned by the pain. Above me, Paul and Carver grabbed Ali and dragged her screaming toward Robert's hut. Robert regarded me for a moment, snorted, and spat on the ground next to me. He pointed to two nearby commune members and instructed them to drag me to the medical hall. Recovery took 6 months. My cranium was fractured, carving a tight line down my nose to my upper lip. The right side of my face shifted downward several millimeters, throwing off its symmetry just enough to make people do a double take when they saw me. 2 teeth were knocked out, and my eyesight in my right eye became permanently blurry, but I counted myself lucky. And among those moments of horrendous pain and rolling darkness, I held on to the memory of Ali defending me, of those things she said about my mother. They opened up the possibility of a hope that I hadn't dared to linger on for as long as I could remember. The hope that perhaps Robert wasn't the ultimate power in our tiny, desolate corner of the world. But such thoughts were dangerous, and I had to keep them to myself. As the years passed and I grew, I learned how to slip under the radar of Robert's religious sadism. My later childhood years saw plenty of abuse, but only surface deep. Lashes, beatings, punches, but none of the crippling injuries suffered by so many of the other members of the commune. Over those years, Robert continued to grow crueler and crazier. His judgment day changed dates more than a dozen times. His sermons came at all hours of the day and night. Drunken ramblings about God and his avenging angels and our Savior from the wicked world beyond, and how someday we would be elevated to the gates of heaven. I would listen to his words and think about them, comparing them to the conversations I had with other commune members. Ali I saw less and less of. She'd soon fallen pregnant after my encounter with the sledgehammer, and her transfer over to the women's hall meant I was left in the care of the other children, with whom I had formed no close attachments. I remained quiet and withdrawn, observing the world through my fractured, uneven eyes. Raging headaches would sometimes through my head, roaring against my temples like a winter gale. These would often reduce me to a fetal position on the ground, and I would imagine myself curled up in my mother's arms. One person I did grow closer to during these times was Cheryl, a woman of 40 with brown hair streaked in gray, with kindly but cautious brown eyes. She found me during one of my thunderous headaches and bundled me up against her chest. I remember opening my eyes after hours of nausea and realizing then that she was Anthony's mother. "I heard what you did for him," she whispered. "Thank you." That was all that needed to be said. From then on, we formed a cautious but deeply felt connection brought on by the mutual loss of our loved ones. Cheryl proved invaluable in telling me how to steer clear of Robert and his gang. She could weather him because she'd been a seamstress before joining the commune and made many of our crude clothes. Her skill afforded her special privileges, mainly exemption from Robert's attempts to force himself on her. I was not so lucky. I had no discernible skills beyond taking abuse without complaint and remaining invisible. My view of the world was narrowed to what was provided by the commune. Cheryl sometimes talked of life in an actual town, but the idea sounded alien to me. So out of reach, it may as well have been the kingdom of God that Robert promised would be coming any day now. It was 1988 when something actually happened. I'd grown up slender, but strong, over the past 15 years alongside all the other commune kids. They moved me into the men's hall, which proved no different from the kids' quarters, save for the fact that Robert's closest followers also slept in there and kept an even closer eye on us. But I knew how to keep on their good side. My mind turned to autopilot during our repenting sessions. My talks with Cheryl were always out in the open, far away from the prying ears of God, and I took Robert's drunken punishments with the humility expected of a good little disciple. His long-winded ramblings still held considerable sway over me, making me fear the outer world beyond our commune, and I longed for the day his rapture would arrive. But talking with Cheryl and remembering the kindness of Ali and the desperation of Anthony kept me from fully believing in his words, from giving myself over to him, mind, body, and soul. The day our Judgment Day arrived in 1988, I was prepping food in the mess hall when a commotion near the chapel drew commune members out into the cold winter air. Paul and John held Ali between them. She was struggling and protesting as they dragged her into the chapel. "Thought you could just up and leave, huh?" Paul growled roughly. "Let's see if our prophet agrees." I made to follow, but sharp nails snatched my bicep. I turned to find Cheryl looking up at me pleadingly. She sported a fresh bruise on the side of her head, and blood crusted above her lower lip. "Please," she begged, "you can't help her, not in there, but you could be of use if you come with me." I heard the sound of cries and protests in the chapel, followed by Robert shouting angrily and the unmistakable crack of his belt. Ali was too tough to scream outright, but the moans she made when the belt buckle found flesh churned my stomach, a sordid expression of pain that could only be made by someone intimate with it. Turning back to Cheryl, I nodded almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," she gasped. With surprising force, she yanked me towards Robert's hut, explaining her plan as she went along. "It's my fault Ali's being punished. We've been discussing leaving and one of Robert's men must have overheard. I told her what I'm about to tell you." I regarded her cautiously, her deep brown eyes alive with fright and something else, the possibility of escape. "There's a telephone in his hut," she continued. "It's the only one here. It's how he keeps us from calling home or friends or—" She trailed off, but I knew what she would say next. Help. Someone to come and save us from the shadow of a maniacal prophet's lust for absolute religious control. My heart beat faster at the prospect. Cheryl noted the difference in my face. "There's something no one ever told you about your mother," she whispered as we trudged along the splintery wall of the hut, snow licking our boots. "After you were taken from her, she began breathing again in the wheelbarrow. She needed medical attention badly, but she was alive. I wanted to take her to a hospital, but Robert came out after us and told us to leave her in the snow." She was crying now, and I looked around to make sure no one overheard us. Slowly, I wrapped my arms around her and held her. Inside, my mind was reeling with conflicted feelings. The last of my fear toward Robert sliding away, and a dark mass of anguish and anger welling up in its place. Cheryl released a shuddery breath. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I promise if you help me, I'll call the police and bring them here. I just need someone to stand lookout." She looked up at me and I nodded again. Together we headed for the hut. No one was inside, so Cheryl quickly slipped in while I stood at the corner, trying not to look conspicuous. I listened to her shuffle around the filthy, cramped nest of our prophet, which was strewn with bottles of beer, torn Bibles, ragged clothes, cans of food, and items of punishment, belts, whips, and that accursed sledgehammer. An ancient black phone lay beside a stained mattress. Cheryl picked it up from its cradle and dialed 911. She cried with relief when a dial tone came through, and an operator answered. Hello? Yes, my name is Cheryl Lamont. I live in a commune outside Sainte Marie, and want to report Robert Gauthier to the police. For what? Rape, abuse, starvation, imprisonment? She looked back at me and swallowed hard. Murder. Whatever the operator said next, neither of us heard as a powerful hand clamped down on my shoulder and ripped me from the doorway. I spun out into the snow, landing hard on my tailbone. Above me loomed Robert. His disciples stood to either side of him, looking amused. Well, looks like all my little sheep aren't as devout as I'd prayed. Robert lifted a hand and smacked me across the chin. My head snapped back and I tasted blood. Snow grated against my spine, and I briefly imagined this must be how my mother had felt. When she was left to die in the cold, fury took hold of me, and I yanked back my foot to snap a kick at Robert's knee. My heel connected with his shin, and he gave a startled grunt, toppling into the slush. Only Paul and Carver kept him from falling completely. "Why, you sacrilegious little shitheel!" He planted a foot in my groin, and my world turned red. My mouth flew open in a soundless gasp. "Grab the little fucker," he ordered. Paul and Carver seized me by my shoulders and wrenched my arms behind my back, dragging me to my knees in the process. John came out of the hut with Cheryl in his hands. She cried out as Robert turned on her and punched her in the stomach. "She managed to get an operator," John grunted. "Dunno if they'll come." "Let's imagine they will," Robert snarled. "I want these two shits out of sight before they get here." They were going to kill us, I realized. Kill us and dump us somewhere. I had to get their attention on me and away from Cheryl. Give her and Allie and all the others some semblance of a fighting chance. I had to make Robert so angry he would want nothing more than to punish me, even if it meant exposing himself to the police. Without thinking, I snapped my head backward into Carver's nose. Cartilage collapsed under my skull with a therapeutic crunch, and he broke away howling. Ribbons of blood erupted from both nostrils, saturating the ground with splatters of red. I broke free, ran at Robert, and tackled him into the snow. He yelled out, but not before I landed a double-fisted blow that cracked several of his teeth. He roared, and John released Cheryl to help Paul yank me off him. Carver grabbed the sledgehammer from the hut and raised it to kill me when Robert screamed, "No, the police, you fucking idiot! You do that and we're fucked! Blood all over the buildings and ground! They'd have a fucking field day!" Staggering to his feet, Robert reached into his mouth and extracted a shard of tooth. He gazed at it in the half-light before curling his hand into a fist and slugging me in the stomach. I gaped like a fish as nausea twisted my guts into knots. Dropping to my knees once more, I felt Cheryl lunge forward to catch me. "Thank you," she whispered into my ear. Then it was Robert shoving her aside and crouching before me. "You know all these years, and I never heard you make a sound," Robert hissed inches from my face. He bared his brown teeth and blood-blackened beard. "I think today will be the day that you do." He nodded to John and Paul. "Take him. We're gonna take him up to the mine shaft and get rid of him before the police come." A quick glance at Cheryl. "You, we will deal with after." Robert left Paul behind to keep watch over things. Carver and John were conscripted to keep my arms trussed to my back, where they felt ready to burst from my sockets. Together they frog-marched me out of the commune and up the hill to the mine shaft. I turned to look back at my home for the past 17 years. Paul grabbed Cheryl roughly and shoved her toward the chapel where Allie waited with a gaunt look on her face. She caught sight of me but said nothing as Paul sent Cheryl stumbling into her arms, and all three of them disappeared into the old building. The other members of Robert's congregation continued living their life as though nothing had happened. For them, this was simply another bleak day of their existence. By the time we reached the shaft, a gaping black maw in the side of the hill, Robert was panting heavily. Years of poor health, cold air, excess drinking, and no proper medical care had rendered him gaunt. His arms poked out at the joints and his skin shone in irregular patches of white and red. John and Carver didn't look much better. Carver with his nose, and John by virtue of the brutal life in the commune. They surrounded me as I was shoved to the hard-packed earth of the shaft's entrance. "Here," Robert said, "is where you meet your god." He wasted no time in laying into me. John and Carver followed suit. All three of them landed enthusiastic kicks, punches, and slaps that stung my flesh in the winter air. My vision swam when a powerful backhand caught my temple. The breath in my lungs abandoned me with a brutal kick to my abdomen. I eventually found myself collapsed on my side, dirt digging into my cheek as I stared down the mine. My final resting place. Her resting place. Robert nudged my bruised side with his foot. "You know I cannot allow anyone to risk our salvation. I was called by the Lord on high to deliver us from the evils of the world. All the wicked will be struck and burnt away." "Amen," Carver and John echoed. They made a cross across their chests. I curled in on myself, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I crawled toward the shaft. The dirt tore into the pads of my fingers, cutting them as I scooted on, inch by inch. Robert helped by slamming his foot into my backside. Grit filled my mouth. I closed my eyes, letting him draw in closer so he could gloat more. "We dumped your mother down there the day you slithered out of her, you know. She lingered a while after, but now she's nothing more than bones in the darkness. Her evil is buried down there where no one can ever be tainted by it again. Now you can join her, mother and child. My last act of..." Whatever Robert was going to say next never passed his lips. The sharp rock I'd managed to grab while crawling deeper into the shaft did its work beautifully, cutting into Robert's Achilles tendon with hardly any resistance. The great prophet screamed hideously and toppled over into the dirt, blood sheeting from his crippled ankle. John and Carver were both stunned for the briefest of moments, but that allowed me enough time to lunge to my feet and smash the rock into Carver's already ruined nose. The sound he made as the stone stripped the cartilage from his face entirely sounded more beautiful to me than any prayer. A ragged hole was left where his nose had once been, and he staggered back, wheezing and gurgling. I shoved him back and whirled around into the giant fist swinging out at me with the force of a train. It slammed into my ear and my vision in my right eye darkened almost to nothing. My cracked skull lurched, threatening to give, but I hung in there. Years of passiveness festered within. All those atrocities I'd witnessed, the awful things I never resisted. It all came rushing out as I absorbed John's punch. Luckily, the man was no proper fighter. The punch forced him to overbalance, and I took the opportunity to smash my fist into his throat. My blow had little force behind it, but it struck flush against his Adam's apple. He choked and took a step back, his boot coming down right on Robert's exposed ankle. The smaller man screeched like the devil, and John slipped on top of him. My entire body screamed in agony as I limped over to John and brought the spiked rock down on his eye. I had to incapacitate him more than anyone else. The big man yelled out as the rock pierced his skull, and he ripped the stone out of my hands. Blood and white jelly pulped across his socket. I rolled off as he thrashed backward toward a small cliff just below the shaft's entrance. A moment later, he toppled over the edge. He landed headfirst on the pile of rocks that housed Anthony's remains. His spine made unnaturally sharp sounds. The big man went limp. My attention hazed out for a moment as the vision in my bad eye flickered on and off like a faulty light switch. I turned to see Carver come back to his feet, and he lurched toward me in spurts of darkness. His nose clung to his face by just the barest shreds of skin. His voice sounded nasal and desperate. "Gunathil ya fothing bathard." He almost managed to get the better of me. Carver reached towards me and launched a kick at my right knee. He connected my leg buckled. As I came down, his knee shot forward and cracked off my forehead. I felt the momentum whip my head back. The world spun, but I somehow stayed conscious. I caught my balance and drove my head back into his stomach, winding him. He staggered, his face a mass of purple and red. As he stumbled, something sharp cut into my calf like fire. I looked back to see Robert had dragged himself over to plunge a hunting knife into my leg. The bright blade gleamed against my skin and blood welled in the wound. Without thinking, I reached back and yanked it free to slice across Carver's belly as the noseless man came stumbling toward me one final time. The blade caught him just above the hip bone and opened his abdomen up like tissue paper. pale pink intestine and marbled fat slid out onto the cold ground, followed closely by the man they belonged to. Carver's face contorted into a rictus of pain and suffering as the life slithered from his eyes. When he hit the ground, he still somehow managed to cling to it long enough to fix me with a loathing glare. Pure hatred burned in his eyes, then fear, then nothing. He expired there, holding his guts like a newborn babe in his hands. I breathed heavily and checked behind me to ensure no more surprise attacks would be coming. John and Carver taught me well enough to expect pain at every turn. Luckily, Robert's fucked-up tendon occupied his attention. He looked startlingly vulnerable at that moment, mewling, clutching his ruined ankle, rocking back and forth while hunched over his injured leg. I wondered what had driven him into creating this hell in the frigid wilderness of Canada. Surely he hadn't intended evil and suffering to become his tools of choice in ruling his doomsday commune, but they did. Or perhaps he didn't see his actions as evil at all. He pursued the grace of his Lord, the heavenly angels that would scour the earth for him and ascend him up to heaven. And he did so at the cost of those who followed him so blindly. Time and drink had warped him into a bitter, cruel man who knew only how to govern through fear, damnation, and abuse. Torturous routines of his devising that cost me and so many others their sanity. I barely felt a thing when he gazed up at me pleadingly and whispered, "Help me, please." Rising to my feet, I stumbled over to him, knelt and pinched the end of his exposed tendon. His howls rolled across the white fields. He snarled at me and tried once more to grab me, so I crunched the hilt of his knife into his jaw. He flopped back on the stony ground, the lip of the shaft rising above him like a mouth. "I only wished to deliver the world from evil," he whispered. His eyes were unfocused now. I'd broken his jaw and his words curled out in slurry clumps. "Call down God's angels. Make things right." I stabbed him, again and again and again, everywhere, anywhere the blade would reach, up to the hilt. Metal-parted flesh and blood answered, seeping out in long, coppery rivulets. He groaned but didn't have the energy to scream. My last thrust found his throat, and he went silent. Collapsing back into the dirt, I heard the first wail of sirens crawl through the countryside. Their sound seemed foreign in this desolate land, a place where Robert's maniacal beliefs had somehow evolved into righteous law. I realized our beliefs were what we made them. He prayed for the world to be delivered from evil. So I answered. Story 2, The Day. The ropes fell from the sky. The sun had not shone on us for more than 10 summers. This carcass of a place, this barren, discolored non-space, life shaken down to its last seed. Its potential is all spent. The heavens and that wide blue yonder above, now hard-boiled into a permanent blanket of gray that asphyxiates our globe. Imagine brewing a migraine inside a cauldron, and you get an idea. Every breath drawn may as well be sucked from an exhaust pipe. For now, the smolder is only ever broken by swirling voids of superstorms that either drown, freeze, or blaze us to death. The very dirt beneath our feet crushed beyond repair, an arid, blistered vacuum, soil petrified into a pinky parchment. No force of creation pushes through this earth. It is an in-between region in which we dwell, neither purgatory nor hell. Take your pick of what destroyed the world. War, warming, viral concoctions. It doesn't matter how it ended. All that matters is what happened after. The day the ropes fell from the sky, suspended from the very clouds themselves, everyone who still could crawled out of their caves to witness the impossible miracle. Tribes who had spent their whole lives drawing weapons against the other stood shoulder to shoulder, awe in their eyes and hearts. Their bodies, which had been falling apart for so long, became reassembled and recharged at the challenge and the promise that dangled before them. 100,000 of these ropes covered the landscape, stretching as far as vision and light would allow. Each strand swayed with such inviting innocence, and each could bear the weight of any individual who chose to wrap their hands around these threaded necks. The people waited a cautious hour to see if any form of malevolent life would come scurrying down these lines. Invaders from another world, perhaps? Ready to enslave. But no such threat arrived. A wind from the east made the army of cords dance in the breeze, and with it a faint whisper seeped in the minds of all. A mental scent, one audible word: climb. All came and heeded the call. Even those who had remained in the dead cities, full of dead machines and dead hives, burnt-out shells, giant hollow boxes, still smoking and melting like ashtrays the size of lakes. Each person reacted in a different way to the ropes. Some spared not a thought on the matter and ran full pelt to the nearest line, wiggling up the thing one desperate lunge after another, ready to escape this reality. They didn't last long. They were the first to fall. The first ones I had to bury. Others took time to study and prepare for their ascent. They gathered supplies, extra clothing, and spent hours roughing their hands upon rocks to build up a protective callus. The smartest ones knew how to coil the rope around themselves as they climbed, granting them a harness in order to rest their arms between exertions. I watched them scaling upwards until their outline was but the size of a flea, blurred against the smoky sky. A dozen or so made it all the way through the low clouds. I call those ones the skyscrapers. But now there are fewer and fewer who can reach such a height, and eventually they all fall too. Why do so many climb and risk an uncertain fate? Well, what else was there to do? A trip into the unknown, some form of excitement and adventure, was an offer not to be refused. Our species, formerly known as humanity, was circling the drain. The mundanity of everyday survival was only broken by the spilling of blood, be that innocent or guilty. We have forgotten ourselves. Reason had evaporated from the heat of conflict. There is no trust, and barely anyone speaks now. For what really is there even to say? I am one of the few that still cling on to their wits, who can form thoughts, words, and scripture. As for the others, it would be generous to compare their intelligence with that of a dog. Infected with de-evolution, they be. I remember seeing one such madman take a torch and spend the whole night setting fire to the ropes. When he was done, the sky looked like it was leaking fire. He screamed at the top of his lungs until his voice went hoarse. At dawn's light, he was sitting in a pile of ash, eating the charcoal remains of his victims. But his efforts were for naught. He barely made a dent in their numbers. They carried on drifting, and people carried on climbing. I stayed below to bury the bodies. I was too old to climb anyway, with my fingers being knotted with arthritis and withered down to dry stalks. In my rare dreams, I fantasize that I can climb, that I perforate the withered whiteness above, where I am greeted by a specter of stars. I hope they still exist. I choose to cling onto the old faiths that many have since discarded, a belief that the dead should not be left on display. They deserved a ritual and a ceremony of some sort to pass them over to whatever lies beyond. I make each grave the same, 6 feet long, 4 feet across, and as deep as I and my loyal shovel can manage. It is a very messy job, and one that I will never ever finish. There are too many fallen for me to cover alone. On a good day, at full strength, I might prepare 10 fallen corpses for burial, but have 3 times that number fall by sundown. The animals take whatever I don't get around to. Miracles are a thing of the past, so I wonder how I have escaped being crushed by a falling angel, like so many others have been. You eventually become numb to the way a body splatters into the ground, seeing everything a person ever was, laid out before you in forensic detail. An autopsy that offers a true insight into how fragile a creature we are. Just bags of blood and bones. I do my best to restore what I can for the funerals. Faces are nearly always bludgeoned beyond recognition, but sometimes I can piece together the structure of the nose or the curve of a mouth back into proportion. I consider those times a rare blessing. Strangely, their hands always stay intact, somehow shielded from the impact. The palms ablazed crimson with burns. Fingerprints scrubbed clean of their markers. The eyes, too, they remain. Separated from the sockets, their beauty is even more striking, comparable to the rarest gems and with more sparkle than the sharpest diamonds. Some of the mad ones collect them, trade them, and play marbles with them. Disgusting beasts. Have they no respect? Once or twice in a month, some pattern of the wind or grace of gravity balances a faller in such a way that they survive their initial plummet towards the earth. A lucky young girl fell from what appeared to be a mile up. She hit the ground, bounced off it twice like a drop of water, then stood back up, and within a few minutes began her climb again, no less determined. Nothing can shock me anymore. Even the first time I saw a mother start her climb, with her baby strapped to her back, I did not react. The child looked at me, with bright blue peepers that glistened against the dirty rags it was wrapped in. The mother had fiery orange hair, and bruises upon her face where rosy cheeks should be. Perhaps she was escaping more than just this place. A few days later, I found the mother's fallen remains, recognizable only by that fiery hair, now dyed amber from her blood. Strangely, I could not find any evidence of the child's body, nor did I find it in the immediate area. Maybe she had time to secure the child to the rope before she succumbed to her fatigue. Death would be certain either way. My ears sometimes play tricks on me, and I catch the sound of a baby crying from above. It must be the wind, I assure myself. The ropes did not only lure people to their deaths, there were some opportunities for joy. The few children in our population would use them in an endless number of games, be it tying several together to make a giant swing, testing each other's strength at tug of war, or cutting away the loose strains to fashion hair braids and primitive jewelry. I taught a few of the more interested children how to thread and knit the material into crude dolls. They've almost become a gadget for these dark times, an object of one's statue. The little ones feel no desire to climb. They are smarter than any of their seniors. One morning, I decided to take a break from my duty and journey across the open scrublands. No destination in mind, just a wander with my thoughts. There are less ropes out in this section, and thus, fewer bodies. I try to remember the last time I heard such true and perfect silence. My mind settles in peace before a black bird suddenly screams down from above, swirls around my head and lands upon a mound of rags, formerly a person, a few yards away, just another fallen free meal. But as I approach, I see the bird struggling to release something gripped within one of the body's intact hands. I shoo the beast away with my walking stick, soak up the pain from my knees as I bend down and prise open the dead gray fingers. The rigor mortis was strong, but my will was stronger. There in the palm, nested like a pearl, was a ball of screwed up, dirty paper. Although it was obscured, I could see there was writing on the page, an art form I hadn't seen in years. My curiosity wouldn't stop clawing at me until I picked up the ball and unveiled its message. It was barely legible. Who knows how this person wrote this so high up, while they clung on for dear life. I read it, and despite the blazing heat that day, my blood ran cold. It read, "Do not climb. I reached the end, and there was nothing." I showed the message to no one. Most wouldn't comprehend it anyway. I tore the paper into pieces the size of baby spiders and let the wind dispose of the evidence. It was a few days later before the teeth of the note's truth took a bite of my spirit. Apparently, some avenue of my mind still held onto the hope that there did in fact exist some form of utopia at the end of those ropes. And even if only one of us reached the top, that would be enough to justify the struggle and my part in the proceedings. A new depression took hold. Not the standard misery that we have all come to suffer on a daily basis in this afterbirth of an existence. No, this new dejection is sharper. It stops me from rising in the mornings or taking the time to feed and water myself properly. I hide away from others and put no effort into my work. When I do happen to dig, the earth seems to fight back at me, refusing to give up any more real estate for the dead. I hammer at it for hours and hardly scratch the surface. Each rejection runs the wick of my life's candle down ever more. Finally, one dark evening, my ankles collapse and so too does my shovel, splitting in two against the rock soil. I crash into the rot and prepare to take in my last conscious thoughts and images. The obvious occurs to me. This'll be the last grave I dig, and it turns out to be my own. A manic noise fills the air. It takes me a while to recognize this sound as my own laughter. So long has it been since I've had any use for it. I pray for the mad ones not to take my eyes. Soon after I am weeping, not for my own life, but that of my dead shovel, pathetically, the only thing I could call a friend in this world. It deserved better. My sight becomes a slowly closing tunnel, and I am gone. But that is a lie. My candle lights anew. I awaken to the noise of soft speaking and Saracens. My sight is awash with blurs, but I can just make out two small figures crouching down beside me, their hands busily assembling something. My movements startle the pair and they scatter off. As slowly as the oncoming fog, I raise myself off the ground and rub my injured body back to health. One strained scuff after another, I walk towards the object the figures were playing with. It is my shovel, now repaired, lying on the ground with several lengths of rope fixed around its broken body. It's even tied in a bow, the same way people used to offer each other gifts. I hold it in my hands, stab it in the ground, push down and lift the soil. It works well, if not better than before. A giggle echoes across the wasteland. The children stand in a V formation, watching me like prey. The social reaction to wave might scare them off, so I just nodded gently and smiled with my eyes. They let loose another happy screech and disappeared into the mist. An idea sparks in my head, something new and exciting. Those children, the ones who I taught to make toys and braids from the ropes, had actually learned something from me. They had innocence, yes, but more than innocence. There was once another word to describe such a feeling. They had freedom of thought. And if the note I found is true, then I need a new vocation. From that moment on, I decided to focus my efforts on tending to the living, not the dead. The bodies still fall through the sky like heavy snowflakes, but I ignore them. Whatever happens to them is their choice, but the people below, they are the reality. I commit myself fully to teaching those who I would usually discard. I set up a school of sorts and relay the basics. Simple methods of scavenging food, how to seek out clean water, an introduction of the alphabet and numbers. Obviously, some still reject me, even beat me, and climb the ropes regardless. But others do take heed, listen closely, and start to see the possibility of a different, less crushing version of life. I press upon them the need to teach others in the same way, for I will not be here forever. What fruit will my students bear? The future keeps the answer to that question under lock and key, as is only right. I had never questioned the purpose of the ropes, or what their true meaning, if any, would be. But there was one theory presented to me in startling fashion, one evening after I had finished my daily lessons. I saw an old man, somehow even older than me, walking across the wild spread, carrying several large rocks in his silvery arms. My curiosity clawed at me again, and I followed after him. He took the rocks towards one of the faraway ropes, and I watched as he stacked the chunks of sediment flat upon one another, creating a platform. With one last strain, he placed the final rock upon the top of the pile and stood back to size up his creation. "Finally enough," he said breathlessly. His tower completed, the old man scrambled up onto the platform, planting both feet firmly on his new altar. It held his weight, but only just. He then seized the rope in his hands and whipped it into a knot, a horrible knot, an evil, disgusting assembly. It became a founding symbol that was used often by all societies in the final days of peace on this planet. The hangman's noose drops around the old man's head, and he embraces it the way one would receive a medal. He sees me stalking him, and miniature storm clouds begin brewing in his eyes. "You hear? You speak?" he barked at me. It had been so long since I had heard another person talk so clearly. Such a shame he couldn't have delivered nicer words. "I do both," I replied with thick scorn. He nodded, and then let a river of words spill from his mouth. These ropes were not intended as an invitation to rise. They were instruments for mercy killings, painless euthanasia, directly from the heavens above. A blessing, if you like. By what force or direction, I do not know. Even those who peek beyond the veil of clouds cannot tell us. When, and only when, your soul has left your body can you truly climb. Your physical self must stay below. We are too dangerous an animal to ascend in any other way, and unlike gods, we must learn to die for our creation. With his sermon complete, he jumped from the rocks and ended his life. It neither looked merciful or painless, and I saw no evidence of a spirit leaving his body, so I can only conclude his presumption was wrong. But then, we have all been wrong before. I did not cut him down. Let him hang for this cause if he must, and if others follow, then that is also what they must do. I, however, stand strong in defense of our new terra firma. The lessons continue to go well, and we had our first gathering recently. Everyone brought an offering to contribute to the meal. It would be a pitiful hill of beans when mirrored against the old world standards, but that can only be a good thing. The event was more humble, more aligned to the spirit of good intentions. The cost was proportional. For a race who once suffered in abundance, we have quickly learned to thrive through deficiency. I take a deep breath, and somehow the air tastes a tiny bit cleaner. The screams of the falling people grow quieter by the day, replaced instead by new songs and laughter, which rise up from our land below in glorious harmony. Story 3. I am the Apocalypse. The cold was the first thing I felt. Even before my eyes were open, I felt a very deep chill in my core, 1,000 spindles of ice sewn between my tissues. I blinked, my eyelids slowly bringing and stealing back the darkness, and with it the desire to keep them closed forever. I was lying face down on the floor, the tiles speckled with browned blood. I moved my arms to push myself up, but my muscles were stiff, almost too stiff to bend without breaking. I feebly pushed myself up, forcing weight upon deadened legs. I began to wonder why I felt the way I did. I wasn't sure how long I'd been lying there. There was the most peculiar feeling in my stomach, a sort of dissolution. Perhaps I had ingested something that knocked me out. Wait, where was I? I looked around the room I was in. It was a kitchen, mostly everything in order except for the few traces of a hurried exit. The back door was open, barely bolted to the top hinge. Cabinet doors were left open, and it seemed only the food readily edible was taken. A knife set was knocked over with a few blades missing. There was blood splattered on the floor, in which I was laying. I could see a putrid stream of it running down my shirt, but after a quick search, I couldn't find nor feel any wound. Each window I saw had the blinds drawn and the lights turned off, as if the house's occupants were hiding. I went into the living room, barely bending my brittle knees into an awkward walk. It was dark, but I could see the outlines of furniture well enough. There was nothing out of the ordinary, except that the front door had been barricaded with a desk. There was a bedroom towards my right, the door closed, and then a hallway near the front door. The entire house was dark and empty, except for me. Where was I? Whose house was this? And then I realized I didn't know who I was. I thought and thought and thought upon it, trying to bring up some memory of a name, a friend, an activity, my face. I didn't even have a vague image of my own face, and the feeling of facelessness was eerily disconcerting. Trying to access my convoluted memory banks, I realized I couldn't remember anything other than the cold of waking up on that kitchen floor. I slowly became more and more sure that I had been poisoned, or perhaps had an allergic reaction. What makes one amnesic and unconscious? It had to be some sort of chemical. What if I lived alone? I checked for a wallet in my pocket, but found none. I tried to call out, but something was wrong with my voice, as it felt and sounded like my vocal cords were shredded. The only thing to come out was some sort of strangled noise, mixed with a phlegmatic sputter. I spat out a gob of blackish-red blood caught in my throat. I couldn't taste it, but it looked disgusting on whoever owned the couch in front of me. Since no one had responded to my vocalization, I decided to leave. Going to the front door, I pulled the heavy desk aside. It was difficult, not because of the weight, but because of my limbs. My arms felt encumbered by hundreds of pounds, and the rest of my body had been struck by some sort of torpor, like it was being pulled towards a supermassive black hole in the opposite direction I tried escaping to. Trying to grip the hulking piece of furniture was difficult, as my fingers wouldn't cooperate, but the desk gave way easily, more easily than I thought it would. I'm not sure how long I spent trying to open the door. Time seemed different. I couldn't tell how long a moment was, as I was completely grounded in the present. Trying to recall waking up in the kitchen was slowly becoming more difficult. After what could have been hours of failing, I orchestrated all of my fingers together into a twisting motion and opened the door. The difficulty of something seemingly simple perplexed me, but I lost interest and soon forgot about it. I had heard of concoctions that paralyze, but were there some that caused memory loss as well? I knew of the Haitian zombies that forgot themselves entirely and served whatever voice they heard after they resurrected, but there was no voice to command me. My experience wasn't quite as dramatic, but someone's blood was in that kitchen. Maybe I survived an assassination? I had been subdued on purpose, and I could still feel the results in my rigid muscles. But if amnesia was an intended side effect, what would someone stand to gain from it? I walked out the door into a suburban neighborhood, trying to figure this conundrum out. The sky was overcast and gray, a constant threat of some sort of foulness to rain from the heavens. The wind was strong, blowing various trash and debris down the street. I could see black smoke on the horizon, rising up to coalesce with the dark clouds. Step by step, I moved the desiccated-feeling body I was in down the driveway. I didn't see a single person, just the signs of an exodus. Front doors were broken down or left open, windows smashed, burnouts from tires throughout the street, and the strange feeling of not being alone. I could sense someone was around. I could hear their heartbeat. I could feel their warmth. I needed to find them. I needed to know what was going on. Someone would help me, I was sure. A too thick saliva began to form in my mouth, a very foreign saliva. I spit, a purple slime tinged, with red hitting the ground, along with something white. The purging of a toxin? So I began to walk. I made horrible progress, walking down the street on a pair of dead legs. I didn't mind it, though. I was lost in a sort of mindlessness, not discontent to just be wandering. The whole time, the possibility of other people probed my brain, insisting I find them. Walking down a street through the eternal maze of neighborhood, I came across a dog, a big Doberman. At first, he caught my attention in an interested way. I looked at him enthralled. But then he caught a glimpse of me and started barking. The barking became louder and louder, and I began to grow irritated. The way the dog stared at me, fangs bared, caused my reservedness to subside. I could feel the fury cauterizing my body, crawling up my spine, making my hands shake. This animal was challenging me, my prey. I strode over to him, oblivious to the deep growling. The dog readied himself to pounce, and the thought of this pathetic thing posing a challenge was amusing. He jumped forward, biting into my calf, hard enough to cause a crunch to sound. But I was so full of rage, so full of hatred, that my whole body was numb. I threw myself upon the dog, wrapping my hands around his neck tightly. I slowly began twisting my iron grip with as much power as I could muster, and nothing in the world would stop me from breaking his neck. He managed to whimper in such a saddening manner that if I could feel sorrow, it would have hurt me inside. So I made it excruciating for the dog, finally breaking his neck after his head was twisted 180 degrees. Then I picked his corpse up, slammed it into the street, and started punching in his ribcage, grinding his flesh and innards against the cement with my fists, until just the head and hind legs remained intact, connected together by a spine and fur matted with the dog's bloody remains. When I was done, I asked myself what I had just done. I now felt nothing. I was calm. I was collected. My mind analyzed the situation, and it deduced my anger as a fair reaction, though I had a subconscious feeling that what I had just done was sickeningly wrong. What if I had brain damage? I had heard a story of how a man had brain damage in a specific area, which caused him to fly into a blind fury at the smallest slight. What if it happened to me? Enough oxygen deprivation can cause both brain damage and unconsciousness. Was I even mentally fit to be a human being anymore? I needed to find someone quickly. I continued on, eventually reaching the end of the neighborhood. 2 cars were crashed into each other, and I walked up to them. One was empty, while the driver of the other car was resting his head on the steering wheel. I walked over, opening the door and lifting his head up by the hair. His forehead was caved in, pieces of skull broken off in his brain. He didn't smell particularly good, so I picked him up and threw him into the street. I sat in the car looking at it. I was sure I'd driven cars many times before, but as I sat in that seat, I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do. I grabbed the wheel, turned it. Nothing happened. There were a ton of buttons next to the wheel, and I began pressing them. One of them made a terrible noise come on, and after forgetting which one it was, I left. I was on a main street. There were cars parked in the lots out front of derelict shopping centers. The occasional sign of violence streaked upon the pavement or wall in a bloody fashion. The lights of miscellaneous shops were still on, though I could see no one inside. Automated traffic lights went through their cycles, unaware that they did nothing to serve the people who weren't there. The place was a ghost town, void of anything that might be alive. Then I saw someone. I was in front of a grocery store, the entrance destroyed by a flipped car. The person I saw appeared to be a man. He limped, and it seemed like every time he put weight on his right leg, it would almost snap out underneath him. He was making his way into the apartment complex from the other side of the street. I tried yelling out to him, but all I could make was a groan. He continued onto the complex grounds, and I decided to follow him. When I passed the surrounding fence, however, I saw a group of people running up a flight of stairs into an apartment. One of them was holding a gun towards the man trying to follow, who seemed to beseech something of them by holding his arms out. From the look of it, he needed medical aid. And then they shot him. I immediately took cover behind the fence, peeking around the corner. The last person to go in was a woman, who made the strangest feeling rise in my chest. I took a look at her as she stared at the corpse of the man her friend had just shot. She couldn't see me, however, and went inside. There was something peculiar about her. She contorted my chapped lips into a goofy semi-grin. I had a feeling like I knew her, like I needed to know her again. Perhaps she could help me sort this whole mess out. Maybe I could find out who I once was. But I wasn't going to be able to approach them if they were just shooting random people. I made my way towards the grocery store. My muscles began to grow flexible. and I could move a bit more smoothly now, though the calf the dog had bitten wasn't as strong as my uninjured one. I began to hope that whatever chemical was in my system was starting to wear off, and that there might not be permanent effects after all. I walked through the parking lot. The place was abandoned, though it didn't seem voluntarily. Some of the car doors were open, some were painted red. One trunk was open, half filled with groceries and a carton of eggs smashed upon the concrete next to it. Dozens of carts were left astray. The car that had rolled over had smashed the glass doors leading into the grocery store. It appeared the car was resting upon a few people, their blood and organs forced out of their bodies all over the cement. The wind blew. It was cold. I got to the dumpster behind the store and opened it up. I grabbed a piece of cardboard, and underneath was a small child, face gnawed until it was unrecognizable. I could see the bone of the nose, though the cartilage was gone. There was an ear spat out next to his head. The lips were eaten in a particularly vicious way, exposing smashed-in teeth and purple gums. The eyes had been slurped out, leaving this 8-year-old child staring into the sky with a lifeless gaze. The skull was smashed in and the brain was served at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The body had pieces picked off of it in varying degrees, in some places to the muscle, in others to the bone. This was the work of something wild, something extremely voracious. The child was small enough to be an easy meal for a pack of starving dogs. There was even a news report about cases like this a few months ago, wasn't there? Or did it seem like something that would be on the news? Regardless, I reached my hand into the emptied stomach, digging up past the remains in search of wet blood. After getting some, I wrote, "I'm not an enemy, don't attack," on the cardboard. The body gave off a foul stench, and it wasn't the sight so much as it was the scent that deterred me. It wasn't decomposition, but there was something definitely wrong with the corpse. So I left, utterly forgetting the small child. I arrived back at the opening of the apartment complex. The door the group had entered was shut tight. I waited, not sure how long it was, but completely content with passing the time doing nothing. Then I thought it would be better to see them coming before they could see me. So I took my sign and went to the cemetery across the street from the apartments, where I would be able to properly observe them. Night came. Everything was quiet. Not a single car passed. No one walked along the sidewalk. There wasn't a single person out picking up fast food, visiting the grocery store, or renting a movie. Orange glows on the horizon kept me company. Anything that a human being might once do was never to be done again. I lay there, silently, watching, alone in a yard full of corpses. I had the same sensation I had in the neighborhood I woke up in, that there were people around. I knew I could feel the ones in that apartment, so I waited for them. The only uncomfortable part was the cold. I couldn't get warm at all. I wished my body would metabolize whatever was in me. I just wanted to feel all right again. I was slowly beginning to forget what exactly I needed metabolized from my body. Was it something bad? It couldn't be, as I felt perfectly fine. I had the vague feeling that I should wait for the people who went into the house, that maybe that woman I saw could tell me what I needed out of my system. I spent the night next to the grave of Chris Redfield. Then day came. It seemed slow, but I couldn't be sure. My mind was only conjuring up blanks when I tried accessing the last few hours' images. The clouds stayed, like a dark harbinger hiding whatever might be bright, whatever was left that could be warm, if there was anything that could make me warm again. Finally, I saw them come out. A few, including the woman. I made as much haste as I could, holding up my sign, until I caught one of their eyes. It was a man, thin, gaunt, bones quite prominent, like an undead skeleton. He had a handgun, and as soon as I came into his vision, he pulled it up, aiming it at me, yelling out a warning. The other two looked at me, and the woman I had seen gasped. I got a better look at her. She was beautiful, even angelic. Blonde hair of a very light color. Green eyes, the color I imagine Mother Nature herself might have. I could see an aura around her, of a bright white. I saw it shoot towards me, and I was instantly soothed. My leg felt all right. My spirit was healed, my being rejuvenated. I loved her, and I'm sure I loved her even more back before, when I knew who I was. She looked at me, mouth agape, expression stunned. The skeleton covered in flesh took a step forward, but she stood in front of him. I held my sign out and she read it. I could see a tear run down her face. They muttered a conversation to each other, but the man let me continue on. "No, how can you trust him?" the man yelled as the woman I loved started walking towards me. "We're going back right now, with or without you." And the other two started running back up the stairs. They meant nothing to me, however, so I didn't care. I dropped the sign. This woman, a complete stranger to me, yet so familiar I felt that if I lost her now, I would lose my entire life. She came closer and stopped. "Is that you?" she whispered. "Yehus." I managed to articulate with difficulty. For this woman I could remember nothing about. This woman that I loved. I would do anything. She walked up to me. I extended my arms to embrace her, and when she fell into them, I ripped her fucking throat out, the flesh in my mouth 1 second, and swallowed in the next. She started choking on blood, trying to scream and failing, falling to the concrete. She was mute, the same way I was. I got down to my knees, making a fist and smashing through her ribcage to get the best tasting organs. I broke the skin, broke bones, gripped her heart, ripped it out and started savoring it. I had no idea why I was doing any of this, as I was now a mere victim of my instincts. This drive took over my hands and jaws, this inherent rage encoded within my existence. I knew the purpose of my existence. The only thing I loved right now was the way her flesh tasted, the first thing I had been able to taste in so long. It had the perfect texture, the right amount of chewiness, and the blood was a perfect complement. I felt an elation. I felt an amazing high I had never known as I consumed her carcass. I felt a tooth get stuck in a particularly calloused piece of hand, but swallowed it anyway. I would regret this later, if I could still regret. If I could still regret, I might regret that after I had my fill, this woman would get up, only to suffer the same bewilderment and estrangement from reality as I had. I might regret that I was purposely going to let her reanimate so she could infect others. I might regret the deaths of the others she would eat. I might regret letting the corpses of children be thrown into dumpsters after her victims did their part to spread this disease. If I could still regret, if I even cared to regret, I might regret succumbing to the results of my twist of fate. I am now the plague bearer. I am now the one I used to despise in horror movies. I am the downfall of my former race. I am the apocalypse. And then I began to feast. I walked down the stairs of the safe house, a volunteer to collect supplies. Ash and Leon accompanied me. We made it down the stairs and walked over to the car. All of a sudden I heard a yell from Ash and turned. He was holding his gun up towards one of the dead. It wasn't just one of the dead. It was my husband. The tumultuous storm of negative emotions I'd experienced these last 2 days had just ended. Ever since the genetic switch within humanity's junk DNA was pulled magnetically, there was no place more like hell than home. Each one of us was now another's apocalypse. One by one, countries fell. The Northern Hemisphere was hit, then America, then our state. It was one swift sweep, like God waving his hand across the world to clean up a mess he had let grow too big. I knew it was the end. The beginning of that end started when one of the undead broke into our home and bit my husband in the back of the neck. Life became meaningless. Until this moment. Now he was back. Back from the dead, not completely, but close enough. My reason to stay alive was resurrected in the form of this corpse in front of me. I could see past the glaze in his eyes that he could remember me, that he had been searching for me. He stared at me, the way he used to stare before he would tell me he loved me. Ash stepped forward, and I quickly stepped in front of him. I read the sign my husband had made, painted in some sort of red, which said, "I am N.A. me, doit attack." His spelling was never very good anyways, but this meant that he was still cognitively functioning. And even though he was a shambling corpse with a shin bone piercing through his calf, I still loved him. I tried to stop myself from crying. "What are you doing?" Ash asked. "That's my husband," I told him. "That's not your husband. He's a corpse, a zombie hungering for your flesh. He probably walked in from the same cemetery as the other cadaver." "I'm going to talk to him." "No, how can you trust him?" But I'd already started walking towards my husband. "We're going back now, with or without you." I heard Ash yell, and then their footsteps up the stairs. I didn't need them, though. The only person I needed was him. The man in front of me, The one with the dilated, newly pigmented pupils that were as ghostly as the full moon. The one with the blanched, sickly pallor, whose jaw hung slightly slack and leaked a purple fluid. He was missing one of his front teeth, but with the bloody and rotting gums he had developed, it seemed like they'd all fall out soon anyhow. He was covered in dried blood and smelled of decomposition, but death was the final barrier, and he had broken it. Now we could be together forever. I stopped in front of him. "Is that you?" I asked. "Yous," he rasped, like his vocal cords had been cut with a scalpel and then sewn back in by a high school special ed student with a cleft hand. I walked up, he opened his arms, and he embraced me. The cold was the first thing I felt. Such an overwhelming cold. I opened my eyes with difficulty. I was staring up at the sky. Massive clouds, dark and menacing, were sailing through the firmament. Lamps lit the area I was in with an orange glow, creating an eerie, otherworldly sensation, as if I were in some reality that never existed until this moment. With as much strength as I could muster, I tried moving. My muscles were stiff, and bending them was almost impossible. I finally got up, though. I took a look around. I was in the parking lot of what looked like an apartment complex. Where was this? Where was I? Wait a second. Who was I? I began to try and recall something, anything, from my memory. Nothing came up. I tried calling out, but the only noise I made was a strange gurgling, as if my throat were full of a liquid. Then I looked down. There was a corpse next to me, lying face up. I had the strangest feeling that this man was important, that I had known him. He was missing a tooth, covered in blood, and obviously killed by a bullet to the head. He gave me a very peculiar feeling, and anyone who could feel sorrow would have been saddened by this man's condition. So I started walking away. I had an instinctive feeling that there were people nearby, though where, I wasn't sure. But I needed to find people. They would help me, I was sure.